Charles Manson, a name that has been synonymous with chaos, manipulation, and murder. As the leader of the Manson family, a destructive cult that committed some of the most heinous crimes of the 1960s, Manson left an indelible mark on American criminal history. In this video, we'll explore the life of Charles Manson, from his turbulent childhood to his arrest and imprisonment. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to keep up to date with our videos on history's most notorious criminals. Let's get started. Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 when he was born, and his biological father abandoned them before Manson was born. From an early age, Manson was abandoned and neglected, spending much of his childhood in foster homes and reform schools. His mother, an alcoholic with legal problems, even left him in the care of relatives for long periods while she served prison sentences. This tumultuous and unstable childhood left Manson with a deep resentment towards society and a great distrust of authority figures. In his early years, Manson witnessed abusive and criminal behavior, which shaped his perception of the world and led him to develop a defiant and antisocial attitude from an early age. On one occasion, his mother traded him a mug of beer to a waitress, an anecdote that Manson told to illustrate the level of abandonment and contempt he suffered as a child. By the age of 9, Manson had already begun committing crimes. He began with petty theft, but quickly escalated to more serious crimes such as car theft and armed robbery. These criminal acts led him to spend much of his youth in and out of reform schools and prisons. During his time in juvenile detention, Manson developed a knack for manipulating other youth, displaying for the first time the leadership traits that would later define him as the leader of his own cult. During the 1950s and 1960s, Manson spent more time in prison than out of it. While incarcerated, Manson learned to play the guitar and developed an obsessive interest in music. He believed that he could become a rock star and use his fame to influence the masses. It was during this time that Manson also became obsessed with the teachings of the hippie movement and freedom ideologies, but twisted them to fit his distorted worldview. In prison, Manson studied psychological manipulation and mind control techniques, absorbing ideas from texts such as Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and developed a philosophy of his own that blended elements of the occult, music, and his own paranoia about an impending racial apocalypse. His theories included a race war he called Helter Skelter, an idea taken from the Beatles song, which Manson believed was a prophecy that only he fully understood. Manson used his musical abilities to gain popularity among the other inmates, but more importantly, he began to develop an ideology centered on absolute control and manipulation. These ideas would become the basis for his influence over members of his future cult, the Manson family. Manson believed that he and his followers could survive the chaos he envisioned in hidden bunkers in the desert, where they would emerge as the leaders of a new world order following the end of the race war he anticipated. In 1967, Manson was released from prison and moved to San Francisco during the height of the hippie movement. It was here that he began recruiting a group of followers who saw in him a charismatic leader and father figure. These followers, mainly vulnerable and alienated young people, were drawn to his message of free love and his critique of established society. However, what began as a group of seekers of meaning quickly turned into something much darker. Manson and his followers moved to Los Angeles, where they lived in communes, one of the most famous of which was Spahn Ranch. In these places, Manson preached his helter-skelter ideology, preparing his group for what he called the inevitable race war. Under his influence, members of the family began to completely distance themselves from their own families and society, adopting the nomadic, cult-like lifestyle that Manson instilled in them. Manson used drugs, isolation, and psychological manipulation techniques to maintain control over his followers, convincing them that he was a messiah sent to guide them. The Manson family did not just engage in communal living and music. Manson began training them for what he saw as the next phase of his mission, bringing about Helter Skelter. Family members were sent out to rob and, in some cases, assault people Manson considered enemies or simply as exercises in control and loyalty. Manson used these acts of violence as a way to maintain absolute obedience within the group, making his followers increasingly dependent on his approval and leadership. On August 8 and 9, 1969, Manson ordered his followers to commit the crimes that would make him infamous around the world. The murders of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others at his Los Angeles home, as well as the murder of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following day, were acts of senseless brutality that Manson hoped would spark the race war prophesied in his helter-skelter vision. Manson did not directly participate in the murders, but he was the mastermind behind them. His followers, under his total influence, carried out the crimes with a violence and lack of remorse that perplexed authorities and the public. Manson had convinced his followers that these murders were necessary to initiate the change he prophesied. During the crimes, members of the family left messages written in the blood of their victims, following Manson's instructions to implicate the Black Panthers and thus accelerate the race war he envisioned. The crimes were not only terrifying for their violence, but for the apparent absence of any logical motive and the absolute control Manson exerted over his followers. This led to a media frenzy and an intense investigation that ultimately resulted in the capture of Manson and several members of his cult. The trial of Manson and his followers was one of the most publicized of the era, with Manson displaying his manipulation and theatrics even in court, where he appeared with an X carved into his forehead that he later turned into a swastika. Manson and several of his followers were arrested in October 1969, and his trial began in June 1970. During the trial, Manson engaged in erratic behavior, intimidating witnesses, disrupting seances, and manipulating his followers into disrupting and acting on his behalf. Manson defended his actions by saying that he had not killed anyone, but that his family had acted of their own free will, a claim that was quickly refuted by testimony from cult members that revealed Manson's manipulation. The trial revealed the extent of control Manson had over his group, including explicit orders to commit the murders. Despite his attempts to deflect blame and present himself as a scapegoat for a corrupt society, Manson and several of his followers were sentenced to death in 1971. However, in 1972, the death penalty was temporarily abolished in California, and their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. During his time in prison, Manson continued to receive media attention and maintained a fan base, albeit much smaller and more dispersed, who continued to view him as an almost mythical figure. Manson spent the rest of his life in prison, where he continued his delusions of grandeur and manipulations. He died in 2017 at the age of 83. Until the end, Manson never showed remorse and remained a disturbing and fascinating figure in popular culture. The story of Charles Manson is a terrifying reminder of how a charismatic and disturbed leader can manipulate his followers into committing unimaginable acts. Manson's influence not only changed the lives of his followers, but also left an indelible mark on American criminal history. Today, his name remains a symbol of the dangers of personality cults and manipulation. If you want to learn more about the most notorious criminals in history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment about what other case you would like us to cover and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you liked the content and share your opinion in the comments. See you in the next video.